Hello and welcome to Resilience, the global adaptation podcast, the show where we'll be exploring the best solutions and cutting-edge technologies for adapting to climate change.
From climate-resilient forests to the use of artificial intelligence to the power of storytelling, we are coming to you from the United Nations Environment Programme. I'm Liz Bernhardt.
And I'm Marcus Neild. In our podcast, we'll be talking to the world's greatest adaptation experts, but we'll also be travelling around the world to meet people on the front lines of climate change to hear personal stories of how they've built resilience.
We're really excited to share some incredible climate success stories with you. Join us as we adapt to climate change, one conversation at a time.
What if I told you one of the best solutions for adapting to climate change has actually been around for a very long time? Way before climate change became a global crisis, way before the Industrial Revolution, and even way before humanity itself. All over the world, people are realizing the power of nature as a climate solution, and it's catching on. Restoring lost mangrove forests is a proven way to protect coasts against storms and flooding. Bringing nature and green spaces back into our cities can keep temperatures down during heat waves. In fact, on a sunny day, one tree can have the same cooling power as 2 domestic air conditioning units. If we look after our rivers and wetlands, they reciprocate and help us in return by providing natural drainage services that prevent flooding. In each of these cases, it's not about restoring ecosystems just for nature's sake, but because it provides us with a shield that we are going to need more as the climate crisis deepens. It's not a choice between nature or people, but rather nature for people.
But before we get into our first interview, there's one last thing that I want you to bear in mind here. Rather than emit more carbon emissions, these green nature-based solutions actually absorb them. So what we're looking at is a win-win strategy where we can build resilience to climate impacts while also taking greenhouse gas emissions out of the air. While you listen to this episode and hear from our experts, try to keep that in the back of your minds. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with our good friend, the director of UNEP's Adaptation and Resilience branch, Mirey Atallah. Mirey is going to share some stories from the Great Green Wall of Africa, a huge vision to use nature to hold back the Sahara Desert. We're going to talk about how the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration is changing the global landscape, how UNEP is helping countries use nature-based solutions, and we'll also touch upon how ecosystem restoration involves so much more than just planting trees. Hi, Mirey. Welcome to the show. Mirey, today we're going to be talking about the power of nature, of ecosystem restoration to help communities, families, and countries to adapt to climate change. But first, we'd love to get to know you a bit more personally. When did you decide that environmental protection was your calling?
Yes, hi Liz and Marcus. Thank you for having me on the podcast. And indeed, that's a very personal question. I come from Lebanon, and when I was 12 years old, my father and I were standing on the balcony actually watching forests being burnt by explosions. And at that time, I told him that one day I would become president of Lebanon and reforest all those hills. And so here am I, some 30, 40 years later, doing exactly that, but around the world.
Mirey, I'm wondering if you might have in mind maybe a specific community or a story about how ecosystems are protecting local people.
Yes, very much so. And maybe here a reminder that in many cases, the restoration of ecosystems and ecosystem services delivers on so many fronts. It delivers on adaptation and resilience, it delivers on restoring nature, and it delivers on social and economic capital as well. And this example from Mauritania is a good one that demonstrates how families in very arid regions of Mauritania were struggling to grow food and to access water. What this project has demonstrated is that it's enabled communities to come together to take matters in their own hands. And in that case, the communities really realized that they could restore old sand dune ecosystems by planting hundreds of thousands of native seedlings. And so once this green shield of that green barrier of native seedlings in the dune ecosystems was established, it's enabled more water to drain into the soil. And so it's where there was a desert, we now see a thriving green community vegetable market, sand dunes, stabilized sand dunes, and the progression of the desert has somewhat been curbed.
That's really interesting. I love this idea of communities using nature as this sort of green shield. And this project is very closely connected to a much sort of grander initiative called the Great Green Wall of Africa. What is the Great Green Wall of Africa?
So it's a little bit difficult on a podcast, but if you close your eyes and kind of visualize a map of Africa, you will recognize that this map actually is divided into two parts. In the northern African part, you've got that brownish, yellowish kind of tint and color usually. And then somewhere to the upper two-thirds, there's that green line. What's been happening over the years is that that line has been further and further going south. And what the Great Green Wall aims to do is to restore that line all the way from the east to the west of the African continent. So now, if you close your eyes again, what the Great Green Wall is trying to do is to take that line further north, that you would have that yellowish to brownish pattern slowly regressing. By 2030, the Great Green Wall aims to restore some 100 million hectares of land, and that represents 250 million tons of carbon that would be sequestered and the creation of 10 million jobs. Beyond everything else, the restoration of this Great Green Wall provides more so a reason for communities and residents to stay on their own land. And so this creates a story of hope and creates a pathway of hope for the communities of the 11 countries that make up this Great Green Wall initiative.
Mirey, that's incredible. I'd love to understand a little bit better about what UNEP is doing. So what's the UN Environment Program's role in this initiative, and how is our organization helping the world to use nature to adapt to climate change?
First and foremost, we're the co-leads of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And what distinguishes this decade from other decades is that this aims to build a global movement of governments, private sector, schools, individuals, private companies, farmers, to support the restoration of world ecosystems. Part of the purpose and objective of this decade is really, segueing on what I was saying earlier, is really to bring messages of hope. And so what the UN Decade tries to do is to really bring to the fore and shed light on those, bright lights, those green lights, those examples and those cases that are actually delivering restoration and regreening our world. And so with 17 World Restoration flagships that now cover most ecosystems and regions, from mangroves to prairies to forests to river basins and more recently to cities, we have flagships that are covering more than 100 million hectares under restoration and that are creating some 5 million green jobs around the world. The decade itself officially runs up to 2030, which is also the deadline for the Sustainable Development Goals and the timeline that scientists have identified as the last chance to prevent catastrophic climate change. But that does not mean that restoration efforts need to stop there and then. It's a little bit like when you've not trained for a very, very long time, you've not had any physical exercise, you're not going to recover your health in a session or two of doing CrossFit. And it's the same goes for the earth and for our ecosystems.
So I understand that UNEP is doing a lot of work in this area of restoring ecosystems and nature-based solutions for adaptation by helping countries access finance for these kinds of solutions. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, for sure. So part of the support that we provide countries is to access the so-called vertical funds. And one example that I would really like to mention is the more recent $60 million project in Jordan. This project is really working at the nexus of land and water resource management. It has a fantastic innovation in that it also has floating solar panels on water canals that have the dual benefit of generating energy through solar panels, but also of reducing what we call evapotranspiration, or the evaporation of water from these canals, and therefore the loss of water resources. And lastly, it's piloting a first of its kind in the region payment for ecosystem services water fund model that will enable communities and the country to continue having this kind of revolving financial resources in order to maintain these water restoration and water management systems.
Mirey, that's a great example. And I think it helps to address some of the criticism that we hear sometimes, which is that ecosystem restoration isn't just about planting trees. So, what would you say to that? And can you give us some examples of other types of ecosystem restoration beyond tree planting?
Yes, thank you very much, Liz. This is a really, really important question. And I think that even though the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration that I was talking about stemmed from a number of restoration initiatives that were very much focused on tree planting, one of the things that the UN Decade managed to do is to dispel the myth that planting trees equates to restoring ecosystems. And here it's brought to the fore the diversity of ecosystems. And one example is the restoration of prairies in Kazakhstan that support a really, really cool species that is called the Saiga antelope. And so not all ecosystems will actually benefit from the same restoration methods. So it's very easy to look at trees and to say, look at the trees growing, and then to see that from little seedlings, you're now having a tree cover or a green cover. But I think that on the long term, planting trees is only a fraction of restoration.
What it makes me think as well, what you've just said there, Mirey, is obviously the importance of having really good climate data. Because obviously if the climate is changing, there's this whole question of, okay, so how do you ensure the tree you've planted today in this environment is still going to be viable tomorrow? So that really, I think, links to the importance of accurate modelling. So Mirey, earlier in the series, we had an episode on the importance of innovation. So linking to that to some extent, what would you say are some new technologies or solutions that are really proving to be game changers in this field of ecosystem restoration?
That's a great opportunity for me to dispel the misconception that technology and that is always something that is computerized or otherwise. I was recently in Colombia where a fisherman has come up with a new way of planting mangroves. In a nutshell, that has enabled mangrove restoration in Colombia to go from a 20% success rate to a 60% success rate, with 4 different species of mangroves being mixed together in that restored area. So sometimes it's about really low-tech solutions that are game changers and help shift the needle.
Mirey, so this is our last question for you today. And do you think we're able to do this? Can we restore the world's ecosystems at the scale that's required?
Absolutely. We as a human species respond much better to where we see that we can act, that we can make a change, rather than those where we're completely helpless. And what the movement of restoration is essentially demonstrating is that it has that snowball effect. And from very small initiatives, we are seeing an increase in excitement around the restoration. I think that there's an increasing response and consciousness about the fact that we need nature for our own survival. And in that sense, I think it's not only the restoration movement that is gaining in power, but it's also, we're increasingly seeing care and nurturing for nature and for our planet beyond what we have seen so far. So not only are we restoring ecosystems that we had already degraded and destroyed, but we are also shifting our production patterns in ways that avoid that degradation in the future.
Thanks so much, Mirey. So now let's go and see what some of this looks like on the ground. We're going to travel now from UNEP's headquarters here in Kenya all the way over to the Peruvian Andes to meet a true restoration hero. Constantino Aucca Chutas, or Tino for short, is a winner of the Champions of the Earth Award. He comes from an indigenous community and he's been reforesting the Andean mountains in Peru using techniques passed down through generations. His approach is deeply tied to his indigenous roots, showing how much we can learn from history to prepare for the future.
Tino tells us how his movement got started, his passion for his local environment, and how his community put on tree planting festivals. He also gives us a fascinating insight into a very old example of adaptation and how 1,000 years ago, pre-Incan society used a range of solutions to withstand a rapidly changing world. Okay, well, first of all, Tino, thank you so much for coming on to the show. Welcome to the Resilience Podcast.
Oh, Marcus, thank you so much for this opportunity.
So my first question for you is, what was it like growing up in Peru? Tell me a little bit about your childhood and growing up in the region of Peru that you grew up in.
I come from the high Andes. Originally, I born on the farm. I spent all my early age taking care of the sheep and cows for my grandfathers and swimming and trying to catch some fishes on the river. I'm coming from the campesino family, descending from these local communities. Arriving to university, I tried to be a medical doctor. Finally, I became a biologist, and being a biologist, I don't like to be inside of one room. I love to be always on the field.
So can you tell us about the moment that you realized that you needed to take action to address the melting glaciers in the Andes?
After to be more than 10 years traveling along the mountains and collecting more knowledge and data, I saw that conservation has been doing very well. And in 2000, this idea of creating more protected areas, yeah, they had been doing something, but the deforestation has been running faster. And even more, the local communities, and they never been included in all these activities. And I said, no, something is not going on the right way. And when I created Asociación Ecosistemas Andinos, this NGO, we focus and put clearly on the mission to implement conservation strategies in coordination with the local stakeholders and on benefit of the local and native communities. And most of this time, during all my expeditions, I think the perfect momentum was when I was chewing coca leaves with an elder on the highlands above 4,600 meters level. The elder called me, "Hey, boss, come." Said. He pointed to me a mountain, said, "Look at that mountain. 30 years ago was full of snow, now not anymore." I saw his eyes full of tears. I said, "This is the problem of the climate change." I said, No. We are doing something wrong. Is that the reason why the Mother Earth that is not permitting us to enjoy for more snow and water. We must to plant more trees. For that reason, boss, help us to do it. That, Marcus, for me was a punch on the face. I said, okay, this is what you needed to do or what the Mother Earth is demanding. Is the reason why I started to do what I'm doing right now.
Why was planting trees suggested as a solution to the melting glaciers? Could you explain that connection a little bit?
We are doing that at the moment. I helped to plant more than 10 million trees. And when you can be with me on these mountains above 4,000 in levels like about 4,500 meters inside of the woods early in the morning, it's amazing, Marcus, to see those trees growing there with a lot of moss covering the ground and the trees. And you can see all the drops of water for everywhere on the lichens, on the moss, on the tree, on the vegetation. Because those trees, the polylepis trees that grows, this is the highest forest in the world and grows from Venezuela to near to the Patagonia. Those trees grows mainly on the main watersheds. Those native trees capture water. And with the moss, everything retains water. And the other thing that increases more is when we plant a tree, we are making a hole 20 by 20 centimeters. And if you want to fill it water inside of that hole with all the earth and the seedling also, you need between 4 or 5 liters of water. Imagine if we plant 3.5 million trees along all the Andes, multiply by 5, how much water we are catching. That is the famous harvesting water that the Incas 1,000 years ago, they practiced all the time.
So did you say that each tree captures 5 liters of water?
No, not the tree. The hole where we put the tree. That hole is going to be catching during the rainy season daily, like when it's going to rain, 4 or 5 liters of water. If you are not going to do that, the water is going to continue running down,
Is it that the glaciers were providing water for the local communities, and now that the glaciers are melting, there's less water security, so the forest is providing more water security for the communities? So my question for you is, so what will happen when all the glaciers are gone?
A year ago, some specialists published a big report that for 2050, 70% of the glaciers are going to disappear. I jumped and I started to dance. It's the time. Now the authorities are going to understand. All the governments are going to take action. No, Marcus, nothing happens. Why? Because people is blind with richness, resources, other things, not really with what's the main issue, the climate change. Water comes from up to down. Water for us is life, is the economy, and the future of our kids. Is the reason why we are planting a lot of native trees.
So without the glaciers, it would be really challenging for the communities to get water and to have water security when those glaciers are gone, right?
In the age 880 after Jesus Christ, a big climate change tackled along all the Pacific way of the continent and kills and destroys many of the pre-Inca cultures. The remaining of that pre-Inca culture practice the positive resilience. They build canals and aqueducts. They build terraces. They do it massive restoration with a lot of trees. And the best thing, they started to harvest water.
I guess this shows the power of indigenous knowledge as well.
Yeah. Everything that I'm using right now, I learned from the local communities. I learned from the books that I read about the Inca culture. The only thing that I've been doing is reviving what works 1,000 years ago and doing again. The solution is simple and doable. With the real and concrete action on the ground, we can do it.
I love your determination, I have to say. You're the president and co-founder of Acción Andina, and that has planted more than 10 million trees, interestingly, with the help of 25,000 indigenous families. What has been the impact of this ecosystem restoration for the landscape, but also for the local people?
Every time when you visit the local communities said, first that we want respect. If the people can respect us, we can talk. We want to be listened. And if it's possible, we want to teach you also. We want to be part of the solution. We want jobs. And for me, for that momentum, as I tell you, I created the NGOs. I put on the main mission that specifically that thing. In 2018, I had the dream to expand from Peru, all the Andes with this project, 35,000 families directly benefited. How they benefited? They receive capacitation, they receive jobs, they work all the entire 8 or 10 months producing all the seedlings, all the millions of trees. Later, all together, they are going to plant all the seedlings on the final place.
And so you can clearly see, with all the ecosystems you restored, with the 10 million trees, can you clearly see the impact on that on water security?
we are talking about between 7 to 9 kilometers of mountains. Imagine that. 10 million is nothing in all that mountains. But think this. All the water that is going to be produced, catch it on that mountains is going to benefit all the Pacific way and also all the Atlantic way. We need to plant more.
So we've established why you went out and restored all these ecosystems, planted 10 million trees. Could you just tell us a little bit? I know might be a bit of a big question, but could you tell us a little bit about how you did that? Because when I think of that, I just think, where do you start? How do you get people on board? How did you do it?
When I attend to the COP meeting in Lima, COP meeting number 14, I think, after to being at the meeting and not seeing any result, sorry if I say it, but nothing concrete in favor of the Mother Earth, I was so frustrated. I get back home and I called to my partners. My donor said, sorry, we need to send a message to the world. And the best message could be what we can plant in a single day. They accepted, and we planted more than 57,000 polylepis trees in a single day. And was starting a party, because for us to plant a tree is a party. It's not just an activity. It's a party where the locals invite the musicians, the dancers,
Yeah.
the neighbors, because they practice the communal work.
That's amazing. So you lured them with parties into engaging. That's really great.
The thing is Keunia Raimi. Keunia is the local name of the polylepis, and Raimi is the festival.
Right, okay.
That became so popular, and this was seen by the other neighbors in Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, who are part of the program, and they started to create their own festivals also. Now I have communities who are competing between them. The last one planted more than 100,000 trees in a single day.
I have to ask you about your long-term goal. You know, if we're looking ahead to the future, looking at the horizon here, what is your long-term vision for your project, or your movement rather?
It started being a dream, later became a project, a program, and as you pointed, a movement, because people admire that we have thousands of people inside of the program. What can be for me the first issue that I have to secure is just the funds. To plant 3.5 million trees per year, I require like a $5 million per year. Even more is going to increase more when we are going to do some conservation programs, because people is desperate now on trying to have data about monitoring. When am I going to be sure that Acción Andina probably in 5 years more is going to work stable and going on? Okay, let's create Acción Filipinas, Acción Himalayas, Acción Nairobi, wherever it can be.
Tino, we're going to have to leave it here. Just one final question from us. How can our listeners follow your work online? Is there somewhere that you want to direct them to stay tuned to the work that you're doing?
Yeah, there are a lot of publications by YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. You can help more. Share this experience with your friends. Use the Facebook, Instagram, all the media. Say, look at, this is the thing, what we can do it. And this is the thing that is working. And this is going to increase happiness and hope for a pure air, for a good water, and even better, for a green and healthy planet. We can do it.
Okay, so that was Constantino Aucca Chutas from Peru. It's clear from our guest today that ultimately we, humanity, are in a race to restore the world's ecosystems before the impacts of climate change become unmanageable. So there's a real urgency to all of this. And today we've heard about some really large-scale restoration movements, the power of indigenous knowledge, how some adaptation practices go back thousands of years, and we've also heard about the snowballing global movement called the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. We really recommend looking into the decade, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. And another point I'd really like to emphasize is the way in which nature-based solutions contribute to many development goals at the same time. So we've heard how these green solutions can improve water quality and quantity. They can protect food from extreme weather. And all at the same time, the solutions protect biodiversity and in many cases absorb carbon emissions, thereby getting to the root of the crisis. It's this holistic dimension, what experts call co-benefits, that make nature-based solutions so cost-effective in terms of adaptation investments.
Marcus, I think that's so true. And it's also not just about us protecting nature, but also nature protecting us in return. But I think to do so, we need to mention something about scalability here. To be truly effective, it's not just enough to restore a few landscapes here and there, but rather it needs to be embedded into policy. And that's where a country's National Adaptation Plan comes in. They offer an excellent way to scale up ecosystem-based restoration across a country. And it just so happens that there's a new online training course that's just come out that shows its users how to embed nature-based solutions into national adaptation planning and policy. It's called Bringing Nature into National Adaptation Planning, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes, and we really highly recommend people to take this course. I also want to give a big shout out to the Global Fund for Ecosystem-Based Adaptation. It provides seed capital to excellent approaches that are using nature to adapt, with the ultimate goal of bringing these initiatives to scale. If you're working on a very impactful adaptation project that's using nature-based solutions, then definitely check out the Global EBA Fund to see if it can support your work.
So, I guess that's it for today. Thank you so much to Mirey and to Tino, of course to our listeners. Join us again next time as we adapt to climate change, one conversation at a time.
This show is sponsored by the Japanese Ministry of the Environment. Richard Myron is the producer, and this has been an Earshot Strategies production.